A humble man once gave $30 to a hungry boy. 15 years later, a wealthy millionaire knocked on his door, a life-changing opportunity for the kind soul who helped him. It was dawn when Samuel, a man of simple means, awoke to the familiar creaky sounds of his small apartment. The rising sun barely lit the peeling wallpaper and worn furniture, casting a soft glow that seemed to animate the fraying edges of his life. Samuel had lived in this quiet, weathered neighborhood for nearly 3 decades. His days unfolded with routine precision. Each morning, he brewed a modest cup of coffee, laced his scuffed shoes, and set out on foot to the convenience store where he worked the early shift. The store was small, cluttered, and filled with the scent of stale bread and powdered sugar. It was tucked beside a laundromat and across from an old diner. Samuel greeted his regular customers with a familiar nod or, on occasion, a warm smile. His movements were slow but steady, his gestures humble yet precise. The lines on his face hinted at a life lived with quiet endurance, the kind of endurance that people rarely noticed. Despite his seemingly ordinary life, Samuel faced financial challenges that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He didn't own much, just a few basic possessions, but every penny was carefully accounted for, and luxuries were out of the question. In truth, his income barely covered the essentials: rent, modest groceries, and the occasional repair for his aging shoes. Yet, he made do with a sense of quiet dignity, never allowing himself to complain about the limited life he led. In the evenings, Samuel would unwind on his apartment's tiny balcony, overlooking the same street he had walked for years. He would watch as the streetlights flickered on, casting an orange glow over the pavement. Sometimes he'd spot a stray dog or a young couple passing by, laughing as they held hands, and a faint smile would tug at his lips. Samuel was content with the simplicity, though the dreams he had once held onto, of a life more abundant, perhaps a small home of his own, remained just that, dreams. Yet he had his health, his steady work, and a reputation among neighbors as a reliable, generous presence, even if his own resources were modest. In his world that was enough. Samuel's life might have been modest, but his heart was boundless. The people in his neighborhood knew him not just as the quiet man from the convenience store, but as someone they could turn to when they needed a helping hand. Though he didn't have much, Samuel had a gift for making others feel like they mattered. When old Mrs. Gonzalez from down the hall struggled with her groceries, Samuel would always be there, lifting the bags from her frail hands and walking her to her door. He'd listen patiently to her stories of the good old days as he helped her settle in, nodding and smiling in quiet encouragement. At the store, if a young mother was short a few dollars for milk or bread, Samuel would quietly slip in the difference, asking her to repay him when she could, knowing she might never be able to. To him, these small gestures weren't about heroism or sacrifice. They were just what felt right. Perhaps it was the echoes of his past, memories of lean years when he'd barely scraped by himself, that made him so compassionate. Long ago, life had knocked Samuel down hard. He had faced setbacks, one after another, losing people he loved and dreams he had cherished. He knew what it was to feel lost and invisible in a world that moved too fast to care. Even with these quiet acts of kindness, Samuel remained unassuming, never expecting anything in return. His kindness wasn't something he thought about. It was simply woven into his nature. He was the kind of man who would offer his last bit of change to someone who looked hungrier than he was, then go about his day with a quiet satisfaction that lingered in his heart like a warm glow. On the weekends, Samuel volunteered at a local shelter. He'd serve hot meals, sweep floors, and share conversations with those who had stories heavier than his own. The people there admired him for his steady presence, his empathy, and his unbreakable spirit. Though his life was humble, Samuel had an unshakable sense of purpose, a calling to lift up those around him even when his own burdens remained heavy. As each day bled into the next, Samuel faced his share of hardships. His job at the store was steady but far from lucrative, offering only enough to scrape by. Every paycheck seemed to vanish as soon as it arrived, eaten up by rent, utilities, and the occasional unexpected expense. There was no safety net to catch him if something went wrong. No family to lend a hand, no savings to fall back on. Sometimes he dreamed of a small garden where he could sit in the evenings, maybe with a dog by his side. He longed for a little bit of peace and space, a life that felt truly his. But for Samuel, such dreams were like wisps of smoke, fragile and fleeting. The more he reached for them, the farther away they seemed. Still, he never lost his optimism. Samuel had a resilience that kept him going, a belief that, as difficult as life could be, it could also be kind in unexpected ways. Whenever he found a few extra coins in his pocket, he'd let himself buy a small treat, a chocolate bar or a warm pastry from the bakery down the street. These little indulgences reminded him that joy, however small, was still within reach. Despite his best efforts, the weight of his challenges sometimes pressed down hard. The older he got, the more he worried about his future. What if he became too old or too sick to work? What if he couldn't keep up with his rent? The questions haunted him, flickering through his mind in the quiet hours of the night. Yet by dawn, he would push these fears aside, reminding himself that he had made it this far by keeping his head down and his heart open. One evening, as he sat on his little balcony, looking out at the world around him, Samuel took a deep breath and let it out slowly. There was hardship, yes, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had always done his best. For all his struggles, he found purpose in the life he led, in the kindness he offered to others, and in the dignity he carried within himself. He may have been one of life's invisible souls, but in his heart, he was proud of the man he had become. It was a cold afternoon when Samuel first noticed the boy. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, casting a gray pallor over the city streets. Samuel had just finished his shift at the store and was walking home when he saw a young figure lingering by the alleyway near the corner diner. The boy couldn't have been older than 13, though he looked small and thin for his age. His clothes were worn and too light for the weather, the edges of his sleeves frayed, and his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if trying to fend off the chill. Samuel watched him for a moment, unsure of whether to approach. There was a tension in the boy's stance, a nervousness that kept him glancing down, his gaze darting toward the people passing by but always averting their eyes. Samuel recognized the look. It was the kind of reluctance that came with desperation, with the shame of needing something but fearing rejection. The boy's eyes finally fell on the door of the diner, and he took a hesitant step forward. But then he stopped, glancing away as if he'd changed his mind. Samuel could see the boy's pride warring with his hunger. His shoulders hunched in defeat as he turned back toward the alley, trying to disappear from sight. Samuel's heart ached at the sight, a memory stirring within him of his own younger years, the times he'd struggled in similar ways, hoping for kindness in a world that could often be indifferent. Instinctively, Samuel approached the boy, moving slowly so as not to startle him. "Hey there," he said softly, offering a gentle smile. The boy looked up, his eyes wide, startled by Samuel's presence. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the street and the distant sounds of the city around them. Seeing the wariness in the boy's eyes, Samuel's voice softened further. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his words warm and simple. The boy's expression betrayed his answer before he could speak, his small nod almost imperceptible. Samuel's heart squeezed, and in that moment, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Without a second thought, Samuel reached into his coat pocket, feeling the familiar touch of his worn leather wallet. Inside, he knew, was only a small sum, enough to get him through the week if he was careful. He hesitated for a brief moment, knowing that every dollar counted. But then he glanced back at the boy, whose gaze had fallen to the ground, too proud to ask for anything yet too desperate to refuse help. "Come with me," Samuel said gently, nodding toward the diner's entrance. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and he glanced up at Samuel, searching his face for any sign of pity or judgment. But all he found was kindness, steady and patient. With a slow, tentative step, he followed Samuel into the warmth of the diner. They slid into a booth near the window, and a waitress approached with a menu. Samuel handed it to the boy, who looked at it as if he was holding something precious, his fingers lingering on the edges of the laminated paper. "Order whatever you'd like," Samuel encouraged, his voice soft. The boy hesitated, clearly torn between his hunger and his reluctance to accept too much. After a moment, he chose a modest meal, just a sandwich and a glass of water. As they waited for the food to arrive, Samuel reached into his wallet and discreetly placed $30 on the table, nudging it toward the boy. "This should help you out a bit," he said, his tone casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The boy looked at the money, his mouth opening in shock. He shook his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I can't take that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Samuel smiled. "I know you don't want to, but everyone needs a hand sometimes. And if it helps you get through the next few days, that's all that matters to me." The boy's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he looked away, clutching the money as though it was something sacred. When the food arrived, Samuel watched quietly as the boy ate, savoring each bite. For Samuel, the meal and the money were small things, a brief kindness. But to the boy they were a lifeline, a reminder that someone cared. As the last bites of the sandwich disappeared, the boy sat back, seeming to relax for the first time since Samuel had met him. He looked down at the $30 clutched in his hand, his fingers tracing the edges of the bills with a sense of reverence. For a long moment, he remained silent, lost in thought. Then, as if gathering his courage, he looked up at Samuel with a fierce determination in his young eyes. "I'll pay you back someday," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how or when, but promise I'll repay you, somehow." There was a gravity to his words, a weight that made Samuel's heart swell with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Samuel chuckled softly, waving his hand as if to dismiss the boy's solemn vow. "There's no need for that," he replied gently. "If I worried about being paid back every time I help someone, I'd have a very different life. Just do what you can when you can for others who might need it." The boy's brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a determined line. "No," he said more firmly this time. "You don't understand. This means everything to me. I'll remember this. I promise you I won't forget." His voice wavered, but there was a fierce sincerity there that surprised Samuel. Samuel could see that it was important to the boy to hold on to this promise, so he simply nodded, offering an understanding smile. "All right," he said softly. "If that's what you want, then I believe you." As the boy stood up to leave, he hesitated one last time. He looked at Samuel as if trying to memorize his face. His eyes filled with gratitude and something else, a spark of resolve. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do this, but thank you." With a nod, the boy turned and walked out of the diner, clutching the money close to his chest as if it were a lifeline. Samuel watched him disappear down the street, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He hadn't given much, just a meal and a few dollars. But as he stood up to leave, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that his small act of kindness might have meant more to that boy than he'd ever realize. The years slipped by quietly, blending together as Samuel continued his life of simple routines and steady labor. His days at the store became a blur of familiar faces, friendly nods, and the occasional chat with customers who had grown fond of his unassuming kindness. Despite the passing time, Samuel's life remained much the same. A modest apartment, modest means, and a modest existence. His financial challenges, however, seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. As prices crept up and his wage remained low, Samuel found himself cutting back even more, sacrificing little comforts he had once been able to afford. The chocolate bar from the bakery became a rarity. His walks to save on bus fare became longer, and the worn soles of his shoes wore thinner with every step. Though he never allowed himself to wallow in self-pity, there were times when he felt the weight of life pressing down hard upon him. But through it all, Samuel's spirit endured. He continued to show up day after day, with a smile for his neighbors and a word of encouragement for anyone who needed it. He still offered help when he could, even if it meant going without himself. Those who knew him came to see him as a steady presence, someone who could be relied upon to give, even when he had little left to offer. In the quiet of his own home, however, Samuel couldn't ignore the pangs of unfulfilled dreams. He thought often of the small garden he'd once imagined, the peaceful home he'd hoped to make his own. Sometimes, he would catch himself thinking of those dreams late at night, when the city sounds had faded and all he had were the walls of his apartment and the ticking of the clock. Yet, whenever doubts crept in, Samuel would remind himself of the people he had helped along the way, and the small moments of kindness he had shared. Though life was hard, Samuel remained unshaken. He had chosen to live by a quiet creed of compassion, even in the face of hardship. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, he believed that perhaps one day, his kindness would return to him, as a whisper or a hand reaching out in the darkness. While Samuel's life trudged along with quiet persistence, the young boy he had helped that cold afternoon was growing and changing in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The boy, whose name was David, clung to that act of kindness as if it were a guiding star, a reminder that even in the bleakest moments, there was goodness to be found. As David entered his teenage years, he faced countless struggles. He moved from one shelter to another, took odd jobs to survive, and worked tirelessly to make something of himself. Through it all, he remembered the humble man who had shown him compassion without expecting anything in return. The memory of Samuel's simple words, "Do what you can when you can for others who might need it," became his compass, guiding him through the hardest times. In high school, David worked every job he could find, saving up every penny with a single-minded determination to build a better life. His teachers noticed his drive, and one of them helped him apply for scholarships. To his amazement, he was accepted to a college program that offered financial aid. Though the challenges ahead were steep, he kept pushing forward, fueled by the memory of Samuel's generosity and a promise he had made to himself. As the years went on, David's efforts began to pay off. After college, he found work at a small firm, working his way up through grit and resilience. His career began to flourish, and with each step forward, he gained not only confidence but also a profound understanding of how a single act of kindness could transform a life. He carried Samuel's values with him, often finding ways to lend a hand to those struggling, paying forward the same compassion he had once been shown. Eventually, David's hard work and determination led him to remarkable success. He had grown into a man who commanded respect, someone who had built a name for himself in his industry. But even as he climbed the ranks and amassed wealth, he never forgot that cold afternoon and the man who had given him a warm meal and the hope to keep going. He had promised he would return the kindness, and now, finally, he was ready to fulfill that vow. For Samuel, time had only deepened the challenges he faced. His income remained low, and as he grew older, his body began to show signs of wear. His back ached from long hours on his feet, and his hands, once steady, had grown rough and slow with age. The work that had once been routine now took a toll, each day leaving him a little more exhausted, a little less sure of his ability to keep going. The modest apartment he had called home for so many years became harder to maintain. Repairs were put off, and each month brought a new worry, whether he could stretch his earnings to cover rent, utilities, and the cost of food. Samuel's life became a delicate balancing act, with each small setback threatening to topple the stability he had worked so hard to maintain. Yet, through these struggles, Samuel's spirit held on. He never let his worries show when he was with others, greeting neighbors with a warm smile and a steady hand, even if his own burdens weighed heavily on his heart. He continued to help where he could, offering his time and whatever little he had to those who needed it. It was in these acts that he found his purpose, even as his own dreams slipped further from reach. But there were moments in the quiet of the evening when doubt crept in. He would sit by the dim light of his kitchen, counting his coins and wondering how much longer he could keep going like this. The dreams of a garden, a peaceful home, a little security in his old age, these now seemed like distant mirages, lost somewhere beyond his reach. One particularly difficult night, as he sat alone, staring at his dwindling savings, Samuel felt a pang of regret. He thought back to all the small kindnesses he had offered over the years, wondering if they had made any difference. In that moment, he felt a quiet sorrow, as though he had given so much and yet had so little to show for it. He had no way of knowing that the kindness he had shown 15 years earlier was about to return to him in ways he could never have imagined. It was a chilly, overcast morning when Samuel heard an unexpected knock at his door. The sound was sharp and startling in the stillness of his apartment, breaking through the quiet morning routine he had come to know so well. He paused, setting down his cup of tea, puzzled. Few people visited him these days. His life was as solitary as it was humble. He couldn't imagine who it might be. Opening the door slowly, Samuel's gaze fell upon a sharply dressed young man with a confident yet warm expression. The visitor was tall and well-groomed, his suit impeccably tailored and his shoes polished to a gleam. Samuel squinted slightly, searching the man's face, but he found no trace of familiarity. He couldn't place him, and yet something about the young man's gaze, the kindness in his eyes, felt oddly reminiscent of a distant memory. "Hello, Mr. Samuel," the man said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I'm not sure if you remember me, but I'm David." He paused, watching as Samuel's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. The name hit Samuel like a wave, carrying him back to that cold afternoon so many years ago. Images flooded his mind: the hungry boy in the diner, the sandwich and $30 he had given without a second thought. And now, standing before him was that same boy, transformed beyond recognition. Samuel's eyes widened, and he felt his heart skip, the pieces falling into place. "David," he murmured, almost in disbelief. He reached out a hand, which David took warmly, their connection spanning across time. Samuel felt an odd rush of pride mixed with astonishment as he looked into the face of the young man who had once been just a struggling, hungry boy. "Please, may I come in?" David asked gently, his tone respectful and earnest. Samuel nodded, still in a daze, stepping aside to let him enter. As David walked into the humble apartment, he took in the modest surroundings, his expression softening. He turned to Samuel with a look of gratitude that seemed too vast for words. It was clear he hadn't come just for a visit. He had come with a purpose. Samuel gestured for David to sit, though he was still reeling with amazement. Once they settled, David began to speak, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "I've thought about this day for years, Mr. Samuel," he began, looking into the older man's eyes. "I'm not sure you understand just how much that one act of kindness meant to me. Back then, I was lost, starving, and too ashamed to ask anyone for help. That $30 and that meal, it was more than just food. It was hope. And it came at a time when I had none." Samuel listened, his heart filling with an overwhelming mix of emotions. He had often wondered what had happened to the boy, hoping he'd found his way but never daring to imagine the impact he might have had. David's face was resolute yet emotional as he continued to share his journey. "I held on to that moment through some of the toughest times in my life," David said. "Whenever things got hard, I'd remember you, and it pushed me to keep going. I worked every job I could find, took every opportunity that came my way, and eventually made it through college. Every step forward I thought of you in that afternoon. I promised myself that one day, I'd find you and repay the kindness you showed me when no one else would." As David spoke, he recounted the years since that encounter, the long hours, the nights spent studying, and the relentless determination that had brought him to where he was now. He had built a successful career, established his own company, and achieved a level of wealth and stability he had once thought impossible. But through it all, Samuel's kindness had remained at the heart of his journey, a reminder of the man he hoped to become. David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'm here today because I want to offer you the same hope you gave me. I want to make sure that you never have to worry about struggling again." There was an earnestness in his voice, a sincere desire to fulfill his promise, as if it were a mission he had been carrying with him all these years. Samuel sat speechless, his mind whirling as he took in David's words. He could hardly believe the impact of that small act of kindness, now returned to him as a life-changing opportunity. David reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, placing it carefully on the table between them. "Mr. Samuel," he said, his voice both formal and filled with emotion, "I want to offer you a new beginning." Samuel looked down at the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside, he saw legal documents and a check with an amount he could scarcely comprehend. David explained softly, "This is a financial gift, but it's more than that. It's an investment in you. I want you to have the freedom to live comfortably, to finally enjoy life without the constant weight of worry. And if there are dreams you've put off, now is the time to fulfill them." Samuel's throat tightened, and he struggled to speak. He had lived his life expecting nothing more than what he had, and the thought of someone offering him so much was beyond his understanding. He looked up at David, his eyes filled with both disbelief and gratitude. "But David, it's too much," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I never did what I did expecting anything like this." David smiled, his expression soft. "That's exactly why you deserve it, Mr. Samuel. I'm here because of who you are, a man who gives without asking anything in return. You changed my life with one small act of kindness, and I've spent my life hoping I could do the same for you someday." With quiet conviction, David explained the terms of the gift. Enough money for Samuel to live comfortably, to afford a home, to pursue any long-held dreams. There was also an offer for ongoing support, should he ever need it, as well as an opportunity to work with David's company in whatever capacity Samuel chose, if he even wanted to work at all. Samuel's hands shook as he held the documents, overwhelmed by the generosity and sheer magnitude of the offer. He looked back at David, tears welling in his eyes. This young man, whom he had once helped in a moment of silent compassion, had returned not just to repay him, but to change his life in a way he had never imagined. In that moment, Samuel felt a warmth, a fullness in his heart that was impossible to describe. He had always believed in kindness, but he could never have dreamed of the way it would come back to him. Samuel sat in stunned silence, the enormity of David's offer settling over him like a warm but bewildering blanket. He looked at the check again, feeling its weight as though it were a dream he might wake up from at any moment. When he finally found his voice, it was a quiet, wavering sound, barely audible. "David, I can't accept this. You've worked hard for what you have, earned it. I wouldn't feel right taking something that you've built on your own." David shook his head with a kind smile. "Mr. Samuel, you gave me more than you can imagine. I worked hard, yes, but I wouldn't have made it without that one act of kindness. You saved me from a path I don't want to think about, and you gave me hope. I've spent years looking forward to this moment, to be able to share that success with you." Samuel felt a deep ache in his heart, a blend of gratitude and reluctance. His humility made it difficult for him to accept such generosity. He had lived so simply for so long, and he had come to terms with the modest life he had been dealt. To suddenly be handed a chance to step beyond those bounds felt surreal, almost undeserved. "But I've done nothing to earn this," he said, looking down, struggling with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I was just being kind. That's all." David's gaze softened, and he leaned forward. Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness are the ones given freely, without expectation. "You may not think you deserve this, but to me you do. You gave me the foundation I needed to survive, to grow, and to become the man I am. This is my way of honoring that gift." Samuel looked at David, seeing the earnestness in his eyes and the sincerity in his words. Gradually, he felt his reluctance soften, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance. David's words began to settle within him, allowing him to see that perhaps this was not just an offer, but the fulfillment of a promise, a beautiful, full-circle return of kindness. Samuel took a deep breath, nodding slowly as the reality of his new life began to sink in. David leaned back, his expression softening as he shared more of his journey. "You know, Mr. Samuel, there were times when I nearly gave up. Life wasn't easy, and there were countless moments when I felt alone, struggling to make sense of it all. But whenever things got too hard, I'd think about you. I'd think about that day at the diner when you saw me, a kid you didn't even know, and you offered help without asking anything in return. Samuel listened intently, his heart warming as David spoke. That kindness became a light for me, David continued, his voice wavering with emotion. It reminded me that there were good people in the world, people worth fighting for. You showed me that one act, however small, could change someone's entire perspective. I've carried that lesson with me every single day. He paused, his eyes shining with gratitude. And I tried to live by it too. At every stage I made sure to help others whenever I could, to pay forward the kindness you showed me. It became my purpose, my drive, to lift others up, just as you had done for me. Samuel felt a lump in his throat as he absorbed David's words. He had always hoped that the small acts of compassion he'd shown throughout his life might somehow make a difference, but he had never truly understood the ripple effect they could have. David continued, "You taught me that compassion doesn't just impact the person receiving it. It creates a chain, touching countless lives along the way. Over the years, I've been able to support people in need, offer them jobs, and help them find the courage to stand on their own feet. And every time I thought of you..." Samuel's eyes brimmed with tears as David's words washed over him. It was overwhelming to think that his single act of kindness had inspired so much goodness. David's success, his generosity, and the lives he had touched, all of it traced back to that one simple choice Samuel had made so many years ago. At that moment, Samuel finally understood the true power of kindness, that it was like a seed, planted with hope, growing beyond what anyone could see. As David's story unfolded, Samuel felt a warmth growing in his chest, a sense of pride and fulfillment he had never known. He had always believed in kindness, yes, but he had never expected it to come back to him in such a profound and tangible way. For a moment, he was speechless, feeling the weight of his own life's impact settle softly around him, like a comforting embrace. Samuel took a deep, steadying breath. He looked down at the check, at the documents David had laid out before him, and then back at the young man who was sitting across from him, radiating the same sincerity he'd seen in the hungry boy from 15 years ago. He could still hardly believe that his small act of generosity had set this young man on a path to success, a path that had now come back to him in such an unexpected way. With trembling hands, Samuel reached out, placing his hand over David's, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, David. Thank you for showing me that one small moment can create so much. So much hope, so much change. You've given me more than I could have ever imagined." David squeezed his hand, his smile wide and warm. "No, Mr. Samuel. It was you who gave me a future. You who taught me what it means to give without expecting anything back. You're the reason I'm here today, and this," he gestured to the documents on the table, the check, "is as much yours as it is mine." After a moment's pause, Samuel nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek. In that instant, he felt a weight lifting, years of self-doubt and financial worry melting away. He realized now that accepting this gift was not just a matter of taking a handout. It was a fulfillment of something deeper, a promise that had traveled through time, from one life to another, growing into a powerful bond. With a grateful smile, he accepted the papers, allowing himself to embrace this new beginning. His heart brimmed with an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. Finally, he was ready to receive the kindness he had so often given. In the weeks that followed, Samuel's life transformed in ways he'd never dreamed possible. With David's help, he moved into a small but beautiful house with a modest garden, just the way he'd always envisioned it. For the first time, he woke up each morning with a sense of lightness, free from the anxieties that had weighed on him for so long. The little garden became his sanctuary, a place where he could sit in the sun, feeling the warmth on his face, surrounded by flowers and greenery he had planted himself. Samuel used his newfound resources not to indulge in extravagance, but to find joy in simplicity. He joined a local community center where he spent time teaching basic literacy to adults and teenagers, many of whom were struggling with difficult lives of their own. He found immense satisfaction in helping others discover new paths, offering them the same hope that had been offered to him. It was his way of continuing the cycle, of honoring the unexpected blessings that kindness had brought him. David visited him often, and their bond grew closer with each passing day. To Samuel, David was no longer just the boy he had helped. He was family, someone who had become part of his life in a way he could never have anticipated. Together they spoke about dreams, about life's challenges, and about how an act of kindness could ripple through time, changing lives in unforeseen ways. As the months went on, Samuel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer alone, no longer struggling in silence. The life he had once resigned himself to had blossomed, filled with laughter, friendship, and a newfound confidence that he hadn't known he was capable of. He finally had the security he had once thought impossible, and he used it not just to better his own life, but to uplift others as well. Through his journey, Samuel had come to realize that kindness had a power far beyond anything he'd imagined. It wasn't just a gift given in a single moment. It was a seed, a legacy, something that lived on, growing and spreading with each life it touched. And now, surrounded by the warmth of new friendships and the comfort of his own small home, Samuel felt a peace he had never known. As Samuel settled into his new life, he became a beloved figure in the community. The story of the humble man whose kindness had come full circle spread throughout the neighborhood, inspiring people from all walks of life. Neighbors who had once only nodded to him in passing now stopped to chat, eager to share a word of encouragement or gratitude. People began to see Samuel not only as a friend but as a reminder of the transformative power of compassion. Using a portion of the funds from David, Samuel started a small initiative at the community center, aptly named Pay It Forward. The program offered assistance to anyone struggling to get back on their feet, whether it was with food, clothing, job resources, or even just a bit of advice. Samuel helped people fill out job applications, taught basic budgeting skills, and encouraged those in need to stay hopeful during hard times. With each person he helped, he was reminded of David, of the kindness that had once been shown to him, and of the resilience that small acts of compassion could foster. Through the Pay It Forward program, Samuel's impact multiplied. People who had once come to him for help returned as volunteers, eager to give back. The kindness that had been passed to David, and then to Samuel, was now touching the lives of countless others. Each new story of hope, each person who found strength because of Samuel's gentle guidance, added to the growing legacy of compassion that had started with a simple meal and $30. The community was transformed, and Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, watching as kindness took root and spread, like the flowers blooming in his garden. Parents brought their children to meet him, telling them stories of how one small gesture could change a life. For Samuel, these moments were gifts in themselves, proof that the kindness he had given without a second thought had grown far beyond anything he could have anticipated. Samuel knew now that his life had become part of something larger, something timeless. He had not only changed David's life, but countless others. In his heart, he held the quiet joy of knowing that his compassion would continue to ripple forward, touching lives he might never meet. As Samuel looked back over the years, he felt a profound gratitude fill his heart. His life had started with humble beginnings, marked by hardship and modest dreams, yet it had blossomed in ways he could never have imagined. Every step of the journey, the struggles, the moments of kindness, the connections made, had been woven together, forming a tapestry of resilience, hope, and compassion. One sunny afternoon, he stood before a small crowd at the community center, invited to share his story with those who had come to know him as a symbol of generosity and grace. He felt nervous, humbled by the attention, but as he looked into the faces of people young and old, he saw their openness and their eagerness to believe in something good. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "I used to think that kindness was something small, something quiet that might go unnoticed," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But I've learned that kindness has a life of its own. It grows, it travels, and it touches hearts in ways we may never fully understand. A simple meal, a few dollars, these might seem like little things. But they carry the power to change lives, to give someone hope, and to remind us that we are never truly alone. As he spoke, he saw heads nodding and a warmth spread through the room. If there's one thing I want to leave with you, he continued, it's that we each hold the power to make a difference. Even the smallest act of compassion can spark something beautiful in the world. So, if you ever find a moment to lend a hand, to share a kind word, or to offer a small gesture, take it. You may never know where it leads or how it might come back to you, but I promise you, it will. The room filled with quiet applause, and Samuel looked around, feeling a deep sense of peace and purpose. His story had become a beacon of hope, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the boundless potential of kindness. As he left the stage, he knew that his legacy would continue to grow, spreading joy, compassion, and hope one person at a time. And in that moment, Samuel understood that his life had been, and always would be, a testament to the power of a single humble act of kindness.